The following story unfolds through an online message board, a little like Reddit, where strangers gather to share their darkest, most unnerving experiences. This particular post, What Goes Around Comes Around, details a tale of karmic retribution and the lingering impact of cruelty. I'll read each entry, beginning with the original poster's disturbing experience, followed by the responses from others on the thread. Years ago, I worked for a company, and the guy I worked for there, my boss, was a constant nightmare. He harassed me, emotionally tearing me apart, to the point that just looking at his face made me feel sick to my stomach. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I left the job. I was really cut up about it, feeling like I had no other choice but to walk away in silence. He was clever though, a master of manipulation. Before I even had a chance to speak up about how he treated me, he spread nasty rumors about me, making sure people would doubt my story if I ever told it. It was an absolute miserable time in my life. For a long time I carried that burden with me, but life moved on. I discovered that I was less trusting of others. I had a hard time socializing too, but I did my best to bury those memories and find some semblance of peace. And for a while it worked. Years passed, and one quiet afternoon, as I was going about my life, I suddenly remembered him. The memory hit me like a chill in my bones. At that exact moment, a few moments after, I got a message from an old coworker. "Did you hear? He got into a car accident, lost an arm." My whole body shook. I couldn't control it. To get that message after I had just thought of him, it surely had to be more than a coincidence. For a moment I thought, was it my resentment? Did I wish this on him without realizing it? Because for a while, I hated him so much that it was all I could think about. Was I able to affect my old boss negatively? We now have a comment from Cute Housewife. OP, I believe in karma. It might not come right away, but it arrives when it's meant to. I'm saying this because I'm guilty of being on the other side of karma, and it got me good. I used to be a senior manager, and I admit I was terrible. I bullied the coworkers that I didn't like. They left one by one, and I enjoyed being in control and feeling untouchable, reigning over my little office kingdom for more than 10 years. Then, a few years ago, my body started to betray me. My right arm stopped working completely. No doctor could explain why. I couldn't do my job anymore, and I had to resign. And here's the kicker. No one cared. No hospital visit, get well messages, no farewell party, no goodbyes, just a quiet, unremarkable exit. At first I fell into the whole why me tragedy mindset. I wanted people to feel sorry for me. But during those lonely months I started dreaming of the people I'd hurt. Faces and voices of former colleagues came back to me night after night. It was almost as if I was being haunted by them. Eventually I got so depressed and quite frankly frightened that I had to see a counselor. The truth stings, but it's clear to me now. I caused pain, so maybe this was the universe's way of giving me a taste of it. Even my counselor told me, never forget the pain you inflicted on others. It has a way of finding you. Now I see that my illness wasn't some random bad luck. I truly believe that it was karma. Karma that I deserved. Comment 2 from Curious Observer. Wow, Cute Housewife, that's intense. I don't know how people bully others for so long and don't feel guilty, so I have to ask, why were you so comfortable with it back then? Reply from Cute Housewife. Honestly, I didn't see it as wrong at the time. I was so wrapped up in my need to prove myself. My counselor helped me realize that it all stemmed from wanting my parents' approval. But that's no excuse. Looking back, it scares me that I could hurt people so casually. I've done a lot of soul searching, and now I understand no career or title can make up for the things that I did to people. I'm living with the consequences now, and I get it, karma isn't about punishment. It's a mirror, showing us what we can't face on our own. The OP replies, "Thanks for sharing. Your story gives me closure somehow, knowing that karma caught up to you and to my old boss reminds me that the pain people inflict doesn't just disappear into thin air. It's got to go somewhere. I don't know if my boss ever reflected on his life, but maybe, in his own way, he learned that same lesson. We all get what we're given, one way or another." This story takes place when I was working as a temp at a factory in Kyoto Prefecture. It was a massive factory owned by a globally known company, and it sprawled across a large area with several interconnected buildings. But despite its impressive scale, the atmosphere felt hollow. By the time I arrived, there had been waves of layoffs due to economic downturns and efficiency measures. The floors, once bustling with hundreds of workers, now felt desolate, with only a fraction of the original employees left. The hallways were silent, except for the faint hum of machines, and the empty workstations gave the building an eerie stillness, almost as if it was a ghost of its former self. The factory had 4 floors. I was assigned to the 3rd, where my team and I worked on various parts for the assembly line. The 4th floor, as I learned, used to be dedicated to manufacturing as well. But now it was just storage, stacked with crates and forgotten equipment, tools, and random items of stock. Most of the workers didn't have any reason to go up there. I was told that only a skeleton crew ever ventured to that floor to take inventory or retrieve supplies. One day, out of nowhere, in the smoking area, a senior employee wandered over to me, one of the few who had been there since the factory's heyday, and he asked me, with a sly grin on his face, "Have you ever used the bathroom on the 4th floor?" The question took me more than a little by surprise. "No, I haven't," I replied. He gave me a strange look and then he leaned in closer, his voice low and serious. "Don't. That bathroom. They say it's haunted. Stay away if you can." I stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was joking or not, but his expression was dead serious. My curiosity got the better of me, so I pressed him to explain. He sighed and began to tell me the story. During the last round of major layoffs, it was brutal. People who'd worked here for decades were let go of without warning. Some of them couldn't handle it. One of the men who was laid off, well, he took it pretty hard. The story goes he went up to the 4th floor bathroom and, yeah, he ended things on his own terms, if you get me. They found him hanging in one of the stalls. Ever since then, people have said that they see him there sometimes. The way he said it so calm and matter-of-fact gave me a chill. I'd never really believed in ghosts, and I figured he was just trying to scare me. But the seriousness in his eyes made me uneasy. I tried to laugh it off. It was a natural knee-jerk reaction, chalking it up to another factory legend meant to spook out the new hires. Some kind of hazing or something like that, you know. Time went on, and I forgot about his warning. The factory operated on a 2-shift system, and every few weeks I'd switch from the day shift to the night shift. With the fiscal year end approaching, that we were tasked with inventory duties. Production had paused and we were split into small teams to organize and count supplies in the storage areas. As it happened, I was assigned to work on the 4th floor that night. The silence of the building felt heavier after dark. Every footstep echoed as if the walls themselves were amplifying the sounds, and every shadow seemed to stretch further than usual. We worked in groups, and it was comforting to hear the occasional chatter from the other teams. But after a couple of hours, I found myself needing to use the bathroom. I was about to head down to the 3rd floor restroom, but then I remembered the one nearby, on the 4th floor. It was late, and I didn't want to waste time trekking down and back up. I was getting tired. Before I left, I told the senior employee, the same one who had warned me before, where I was heading. His face darkened and said, "You're really going to use the 4th floor bathroom?" I gave a nonchalant shrug. Yeah, it's closer. I tried not to look scared. He looked at me, like he wanted to say something, but finally just nodded and said, "All right, but be careful." With his words in the back of my mind, I made my way through the long, quiet hallway. Outside the bathroom door, I noticed one of those curved mirrors mounted high on the wall, the kind they use to help people avoid collisions around corners. I glanced at my reflection as I approached, but just as I turned my eyes back to the door, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a toilet flushing. I froze. Who else would be here at this hour? My heart began to beat faster, but I quickly remembered the senior employee's story and the fact that our bathrooms were equipped with automatic flush systems. It's just a random flush, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. I took a deep breath and I pushed open the door. The bathroom was dimly lit, casting odd shadows along the tiled walls. As I walked in, I felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. But I shook off the feeling and made my way over to the sink. Then I heard it. A faint trickle. My eyes were drawn to the faucet at the sink next to mine. Water was dripping steadily, each drop echoing louder than it should have. The faucet was one of those sensor types designed to stop automatically, but there was no reason for it to be dripping like that. I tried to rationalize it and thought of it as nothing more than maybe a malfunction. But I realized something. The bathroom felt colder, the air thickening with a sense of foreboding. Trying to ignore it, I hurried to finish. But as I straightened up and looked into the mirror, my breath got caught in my throat. Behind me, reflected in the mirror, was the silhouette of a man in a factory uniform. His face was pale, his eyes dull. He wore a blank, emotionless expression. He stood so close behind me that I could almost feel him. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. I felt sick with dread, but I forced myself to turn back to the mirror, hoping that maybe I'd imagined it or seen something that looked vaguely human shape, that tricked my brain, but there was nothing. Nothing now, just my own pale, frightened face staring back at me. My hands shook as I tried to compose myself. I left the bathroom as quickly as I could, feeling a prickling sensation along my skin as if unseen eyes were boring into my back. Just as I reached the hallway, I caught sight of something in that curved mirror outside the bathroom door, and my stomach dropped. In the mirror, I could see him. The man in the uniform. He was standing just inside the doorway, looking at me. His face was blank, but his eyes, they were fixed right on me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, nearly tripping over my own feet. When I finally turned around to look with my own eyes, he was gone. Shaking, I bolted back to the work area, and every step felt like he was right behind me. I didn't look back, I couldn't bear to. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even during my shifts. Sometimes I'd feel a presence just out of sight, a weight pressing down on me. Especially whenever I went near the 4th floor. The factory felt haunted by more than just his spirit. Every empty hallway, every shadow seemed to pulse with memory, as if this building remembered his despair. A few weeks later, I quit. I couldn't take the constant feeling that something or someone was watching, waiting. Even now, when I'm far from that place, I still find myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there. I'll never forget those eyes, those dull and accusing eyes. Feels like he could follow me forever. No, you don't forget seeing something like that, let me tell you. Hi, Jay here. This one reminds me of my earlier content. Make of that what you will, but for nostalgia's sake, let's bring back some old school music. Let me tell you about the one time I truly felt terror. It was a few years ago during a chilly March break. Right before the new school term was set to start, my friend came to me with an offer, in hindsight, that I should have flat out refused. "It's an easy 30,000 yen each, and it'll just be for a couple of days," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He explained that he received the job offer from a middle-aged man, a regular he met while playing pachinko. The man seemed trustworthy enough at the time, and my friend was drawn into the idea of some easy cash. The gig itself sounded straightforward enough, though strange. Travel to an unnamed city somewhere in the Kansai region to clean an abandoned house. The man assured my friend that the house had electricity, running water and gas, along with 2 futons, so we wouldn't have to worry about bringing anything extra. Still, it felt a bit off. Why would someone approach a stranger with such a job? And why offer such a high amount? For what sounded like it should have been about a few hours' work. But my friend was adamant. "It'll be fun," he suggested, "an adventure." Besides, I could really use the money to upgrade my computer. The allure of 30,000 yen, practically for free, eventually wore me down. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The day of work arrived and the man handed us Shinkansen tickets, written instructions on how we should reach the property, and a set of somewhat cryptic notes about the cleaning work itself. He didn't share much more than that, and didn't linger once he handed off the tickets and the information. We shrugged it off and took our seats on the train, laughing and talking about what we'd do with our money once the job was over. After a long train ride and a taxi ride to the address, we finally arrived. The place wasn't what I had imagined. The property was enormous, the house sitting like a forgotten relic in a sea of tangled weeds and dry, crumbling earth. The mansion itself was large, the kind that might have once belonged to a wealthy family, but now it had an ominous, decayed look, the kind of emptiness that goes beyond simple neglect. The yard was choked with weeds and thorny brambles, and an old stagnant pond sat nearby, its water thick with algae. It gave off a putrid smell. I noticed a few broken garden statues around the yard, their blank eyes fixated on the ground, half buried under years of overgrown vegetation. "This place is pretty creepy," I muttered. My friend laughed it off, but even seemed a bit uneasy as we approached the front door, which groaned under our touch, opening into a dark, stale-smelling hallway. Inside the house was even eerier. The rooms were filled with old, dusty furniture covered in moldy sheets, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. We didn't talk much as we explored, both of us quietly taking in the heavy silence that hung in every corner. After a brief tour to get our bearings, we decided to start the job. The quicker we started, the quicker we could be finished and be on our way out of there, right? We tackled the second floor first, sorting through piles of trash, moving dust-caked furniture, and bagging up years of accumulated junk. By the time night fell, we were exhausted. We had agreed to grab dinner at a family restaurant nearby, so we locked up and headed out, grateful to escape that place and all its dust, even if just for an hour or so. When we returned, something felt wrong. I didn't notice it at first, but as soon as I stepped through the door, a shiver ran down my spine. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing up. The house, which had merely felt old and abandoned earlier, now seemed hostile. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like it didn't want us to come back. There was an oppressive atmosphere, a chill that wasn't just from the cold. My friend seemed to notice it too. "Did it always feel this creepy?" he muttered, his voice low. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the feeling. I just wanted to get our work over with as fast as possible and get paid. "It's just in our heads," I said, not quite believing it myself. We went about setting up our futons in the living room on the first floor, close to the entrance, thinking it was the safest and most accessible place to sleep. After a little more cleaning, and of course a shower, I must have dozed off quickly because the next thing I remember was being shaken awake by my friend. "Did you hear that?" he whispered urgently, his eyes wide. I groaned, about to tell him, "Let me sleep," when I heard it too. Voices. Low, murmuring voices, coming from somewhere inside the house. The sound was faint but unmistakable, as if several people were whispering to each other, just barely audible in the silence of the night. The voices seemed to come from the far end of the house, down a long, dark corridor. Panic was rising in my chest, and I could see the same fear in my friend's face. The man who had hired us hadn't mentioned anyone else being in the house, and there was no reason for anyone to show up in the middle of the night. But what could we do? As terrifying as it was, we knew we couldn't ignore it. We stood up, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the silence, as we tiptoed towards the voices. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from our phones, casting shadows on the walls. I called out, "Is someone there?" My voice sounding hollow, swallowed by the house. There was no response, only the continuous, unintelligible murmuring, like a distant chant. My friend and I exchanged a look, a silent understanding that neither of us wanted to go any further. But before I could suggest turning back, my friend grabbed my arm and pointed ahead. "That door," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look at that door." I squinted, trying to see what he meant, and then I realized the door where the voices seemed to be coming from was boarded up from the outside. Thick, rough planks were nailed tightly across it, completely sealing the room shut. "There's no way anyone could be in there," I muttered, the words catching in my throat. Yet the murmuring continued, a chorus of voices beyond the door. Suddenly my friend pulled me back, his hand trembling. "Let's check outside," he said, his voice strained. We rushed out through the front door, not daring to look back, and circled around to the back of the house. The room with the voices had a small window, also boarded up, just like the door. At this point, logic had left us. I was barely thinking, my heart pounding as I strained my ears, trying to hear if the voices were still there. Or they were, a faint murmur drifting out from behind the planks of wood. Against all common sense, I peered through a small gap in the window, using the flashlight on my phone to see inside. There was a tatami mat floor, a table in the middle of the room, and a box. The box sat on the table, wrapped in heavy chains, secured with padlocks. It looked ancient, and the sight of it filled me with a deep, inexplicable dread. "What's that?" my friend whispered, leaning over to look. But before we could take a closer look, a loud, sudden bang rang out from inside the room. The sound was violent, like something had slammed into the window from the other side. I stumbled back, my friend gripping my arm, his face pale as a bedsheet. And then we saw it. Through the narrow crack between the planks, a pair of eyes were staring back at us, cold, expressionless eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Another pair of eyes appeared next to it, then another. Soon 4 or 5 sets of eyes were watching us, unblinking and hollow. We ran. Oh, we ran, and we didn't look back, sprinting as fast as we could down the road until we reached a street light several hundred yards away. There, gasping for breath, we collapsed onto the ground, our minds struggling to process what we had just seen. An elderly man, likely a local, noticed us and approached cautiously. "What are you kids doing out here?" he asked, his tone concerned. I tried to explain, but the words tumbled out in a mess, something about the voices, the eyes, and the strange box on the table. The old man's face darkened, and, after a moment of silence, he sighed. "A house is a long history," he said quietly. "Disputes over land, disappearances. It's best you leave that alone. You come with me, you can stay at my house tonight. Forget about the money and go home tomorrow." Too exhausted to protest, we followed him. His wife was kind, giving us warm tea and a place to sleep. The next morning, we thanked him profusely and headed back to the train station. I called the man who offered the job, intending to quit and even offering to cover the transportation costs. When I told him what happened, he went silent, and after a long while he muttered, "Oh, so I guess it's still happening then." He hung up quickly after that, and that was the last I ever heard from him. He didn't ask for any of his money back for the transportation costs. That was all. As we left town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, a lingering sense of dread that followed us home. Later, curiosity got the better of us, and we tried to research the house, but all we found were vague records and whispers about tragedies long ago. Nothing concrete. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but sometimes I wake up in the dead of night, haunted by the memory of those unblinking eyes staring back at us through the darkness, and that weird box covered in chains on the table. It's all there, as if it happened yesterday, like a perfect memory, as if it's all waiting for us to return. Let me take you back to a few years ago when I worked at a pachinko parlour. Hi, Jay here. For those who are unaware, a A pachinko parlour is a Japanese gaming arcade where people play pachinko, a popular mechanical game similar to pinball in a way. Players shoot small metal balls into the machine, aiming to win more balls, which can later be exchanged for prizes or tokens that can sometimes be converted to cash. These parlours are common across Japan and often feature bright lights and loud sounds. Now, if you've ever set foot in one, you know the types that come and go. You meet a lot of characters, some folks just there for a good time, some are hardcore gamblers. The type that looks like they can't rest until they get a win, and others who seem to have stories of their own. My workplace was no different. I'll admit though, it was a decent place to work. We got hourly breaks. Shifts were reasonable, and compared to most jobs, the workload wasn't too stressful. But it was still a pachinko parlour, and this place attracted some interesting types, both the customers and the staff. My colleagues were, let's say, an unusual bunch. One of my senior co-workers had actually been a former gang member. He had a shady past, and rumour had it that he was laying low here, hiding out after running from something in his hometown. Another co-worker supposedly had massive debts, and was only one missed payment from being hunted down by loan sharks. Yeah, it was that kind of place. They hired people without asking questions about their background. And then, there was the son of a well-known businessman, a guy whose father owned a really popular bowling alley in the town. The son had joined us at the pachinko parlour as a part-timer. Now, you'd think with family connections like that, he'd carry himself well, but this guy? He looked nothing like the polished, wealthy image you'd expect. His clothes were always wrinkled, and his hair a mess. He rarely made it to work on time, if he showed up at all. He'd miss shifts without saying a word, and didn't seem to care much for anything, let alone his job. To be honest, he had this unsettling vibe, like someone who's constantly running from himself. Needless to say, he didn't last long. He quit pretty quickly, and honestly, I was relieved. Something about him just gave me the creeps. Shortly after he left, we had a company trip to Hokkaido, and that's when things took a strange, almost surreal turn. One evening during our trip, I got an unexpected call. It was the police, saying that my car had been in an accident. I nearly dropped my phone. My car? In an accident? How? Now, I did have a car, and I was living in the company dorms at the time, but here's the thing. Like I said, I was in Hokkaido. My car was back at the dorms, parked securely, and, as far as I knew, locked up tight. I was hundreds of miles from my car, so naturally, I was baffled. I'd been enjoying my first time in Hokkaido, but suddenly, my excitement faded away. Confusion replaced it. Did someone steal my car? Or did this cop who called me have it all wrong? I tried to calm down and get the details, and I eventually discovered that they were actually talking about my car. The police informed me that they had caught someone driving it, and that person driving my car was none other than that ex-co-worker of mine, the bowling alley owner's son. I was floored. I hadn't seen or talked to this guy outside of work. Like I said, he gave me the creeps. Why was he in my car? How did he even get it in the first place? It didn't make any sense. So when I got back from my trip, I went straight to the police station to sort everything out. And that's when I learned the full, unbelievable truth. Apparently this guy had somehow made a copy of my apartment key. The dorm's dining hall was just below our workplace, and there were a few times that I'd head down to eat without locking my room. In one of those moments, he admitted that he slipped into my room and made a copy of my key. Once he had access to my place, he used the key to come and go as he pleased. He'd taken his time rummaging around, relaxing, probably enjoying whatever snacks he found, until he decided to take my car keys too. Then, he got into my car and drove it away as if it was his own. But it gets worse. His plan apparently was to take off and somehow live out of my car, moving from town to town, hoping to make ends meet however he could. He didn't have a license, but that didn't stop him. When he took my car, he took it on a joyride. He drove recklessly, crashing it right into a telephone pole. The damage? Well, my car was totaled, completely unsalvageable, and I was so upset because I really loved my car. Well, to be honest, I felt a mix of rage and disbelief, more than upset. To make matters worse, the guy had no means of paying me back for the damage. He was broke, and there was no way I was ever going to see a single yen out of him. Thankfully, his father, who I guess was as fed up with him as I was, stepped in and covered the damages. I don't know what I would have done if that didn't happen. After that incident, I became paranoid about locking my doors and guarding my keys. I moved out of the dorm and found a more secure apartment with better locks and security. That experience taught me a harsh lesson. You can never be too careful about who you trust or what you leave unlocked. I've met a lot of characters in my life, but no one as reckless and out of control as that guy. This story comes from a part-time job that I used to have in a high-rise office building. You know the type, tall, glass-walled, packed with a dozen floors and offices. The kind of place that looks beautiful in a cityscape but feels a little cold and impersonal inside. The building had express elevators that only stopped at certain floors, every 8 to be exact. So if you were going to floors 1 to 16, you'd start on floor 1, ride up the express to 8, and then stop at each floor from there. It was a strange but an efficient system. After 8 o'clock at night, things got a bit inconvenient though. That's when the companies on the floors 1 through 7 closed down. And for security, the elevators from the ground floor would only take you up to floor 8. Once there, you would have to show your ID badge to the security guard to catch a different elevator. For those of us on the lower floors, like my office on 12, it was a bit of a pain, but it had become routine. One particular evening, we had stayed late to finish a project. Another part-timer and I had been sent to pick up some printed materials that had been delayed, and by the time we got back to the building, it was just past 8 p.m. We sprinted through the lobby and barely made it to the last express elevator before the doors slid shut. We were both out of breath, laughing about our close call as we leaned against the walls, letting the adrenaline wear off. My coworker pressed the button for floor 12 and then turned back to ask if anybody else needed a floor. That's when we realized that we weren't alone. There, in the back corner of the elevator, stood an older man. He was slim, with neat, dark-framed glasses, and a short-sleeved shirt, odd for the middle of winter. His face was gentle, almost serene, with a warmth that's rare to see in a stranger, especially in a building full of office workers. Something about him made you instantly feel at ease. "Would you mind pressing floor 9 for me?" he said, with a polite nod. His voice was soft and kind. Although we were total strangers, he had this kind of grandfatherly way about him that made me feel as if we'd met before. My coworker pressed the button and the man gave us a smile. "It's a lot of work staying late, you know," he said, his voice tinged with quiet concern. "Make sure you're taking care of yourself." He had the look of someone who genuinely meant it. When the elevator chimed, signaling a stop, my coworker and I automatically stepped aside, making room for the man to exit. But just as the doors opened, we heard a voice from outside the elevator. "What are you two doing? Blocking the door. It's going to close on you." It was our manager, leaning casually against the wall, cigarette in hand. He was looking at us, as if we'd gone mad. The floor indicator on the wall showed a familiar symbol, the logo for the 12th floor. Well, we exchanged a look, both of us in total disbelief. I turned back to glance at the man we had made room for, but no one was there. The elevator was completely empty. My coworker had looked just as confused as I did. And we both fumbled out of the elevator, glancing back one more time as the doors shut, wondering, where the hell has he gone? Our manager saw our bewildered expressions and chuckled. "Huh, you must have run into Saeki-san." The name meant nothing to us, but our manager just shrugged, like it was no big deal. He explained that years ago, back when he was new to the company, there had been this kind man named Saeki, who worked for a securities firm on the 9th floor. Saeki-san had been nearing retirement and was well known throughout the building, even by people who didn't work directly with him. He was famous for looking out for others, always making sure that anyone who seemed overworked or stressed got a kind word from him. One night, after a particularly grueling day at work, he returned from a late meeting, looking especially worn out. Sometime during the night, he collapsed in the elevator lobby on the 9th floor. The cleaning staff found him early the next morning, slumped over near the express elevator. The entire building was devastated, and hundreds of people from different offices attended his funeral. The security staff in particular was deeply affected. They regretted not having seen him sooner, not being able to help him when he needed it most. As a result, they implemented a new elevator curfew, cutting access after 8 p.m. to make sure no one would be left alone and unaccounted for during the late hours. People say he still shows up every now and then, usually to people who are pushing themselves too hard, my manager said, his voice softening. It's like his way of reminding us to take it easy, not to overdo it. With a rare and almost fatherly smile, he added, "Well, you know what? If you ran into Saeki-san, maybe it's a sign you should head home tonight. Get some rest. Oh, and actually, you two go ahead and take tomorrow off too." I glanced over at my coworker, who still looked a little shaken. Later, he admitted that he'd been feeling feverish that day, but had been planning to come in the next day. It was only after he took that unexpected day off that his fever broke. If our manager hadn't insisted, he would have likely forced himself to work through it. Even now, I remember Saeki-san's gentle smile, the warmth in his voice, and the kind look in his eyes. It didn't seem like a ghost. He'd felt as real as any of us, and for a moment we'd been strangers, sharing a quiet moment in the late night calm of an empty elevator. Even now, I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do believe in the kindness that lingers, even beyond one's time. Maybe that's what we felt that night. The gentle presence of someone who never really left, watching over those who needed it the most. And perhaps every once in a while there's a kind soul like Saeki-san, who keeps looking out for the weary, the overworked, reminding them with a gentle smile to take care of themselves. It's comforting to think that even after he was gone, Saeki-san continued his quiet watch over the building, making sure that none of us pushed ourselves as far as he did. After all, in Japan, overworking to the point of death is a recognized phenomenon. Karoshi, workers can be so consumed by responsibility that they ignore their physical limits until it's too late. People like Saeki-san serve as gentle reminders to the overburdened, urging us to slow down and value our health over endless hours of work. Perhaps he was one of those souls who had pushed himself beyond his limits, only to become a lasting guardian in the end, quietly protecting those who risked following his same path.